Welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into a truly fascinating mirror concept. We're going to explore this massive, almost unbelievable paradox right at the intersection of computer engineering and sociology. It's this core idea that we actually have to enforce absolute, rigid, crystal-like perfection in our computer chips, just so we can turn around and shatter rigid, calcified caste systems in human society. We're basically looking at the ultimate transition from absolute hardware exactness straight to human social mobility. Let's get into it.
Okay, really quickly, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the modality gap, move into tempering the silicon crystal, then explore the calcification of caste. After that, we'll look at shedding the skin, and finally, wrap up with the fluid forest topology.
All right, Section 1, the modality gap, human mind versus silicon.
To really get this, we have to look at the profound physical divide between the messy, beautifully imaginative human mind and the bare, unforgiving metal of a computer processor. On one side, we have our organic cognition, what researchers call OS alpha. It's fluid, it's associative, it's fuzzy, and it is entirely driven by human meaning and intent. But on the exact opposite side, well, we have the physical silicon hardware. It doesn't care about your nuance or your meaning. It is cold, it's rigid, and it operates purely on discrete, clocked voltage levels, driven by the arithmetic logic unit, or the ALU. We're essentially trying to force this flowing river of human thought through a perfectly rigid mechanical grid.
So, how do we usually bridge that gap when the math gets really heavy? Well, modern computing usually leans on a hardware component called the floating point unit. Let's call it the FPU gambler. Now, the FPU is incredibly fast, for sure, but it handles complex math by basically throwing darts at a dartboard, using secret proprietary seed cables burned right into the silicon. Because it makes these probabilistic, lossy guesses, it triggers what researchers call the wood chipper effect. When your hardware is just guessing the math, the exact path of your data, its provenance, is permanently destroyed. Think of it exactly like throwing your data into a fruit smoothie. You might know what fruits you tossed into the blender at the start, but you can never, ever reverse engineer that smoothie back into its original, perfectly intact ingredients. The absolute truth of the data is just gone.
To fix this invisible hardware crisis, we have to look at the total opposite of the FPU gambler, the ALU surveyor. The ALU doesn't guess. It deals strictly in 100% exact, deterministic hardware truths. Think of it like a surveyor out in the field with a precision laser. Inside the ALU, 1 + 1 equals exactly 2. Every single time, on every single CPU on Earth, there is literally zero guessing. It operates on this relentless metronome of absolute facts, which creates a globally accountable, universal witness. And that perfectly, forensically accountable digital trust, that is the foundation we absolutely must have.
Which brings us to Section 2, tempering silicon, the silicon crystal. Let's talk about how developers lock this down. How do they actually enforce this exactness? It's a process that is quite literally akin to tempering fuzzy, flowing heat into a perfectly rigid silicon crystal. To pull this off, developers use something called global remainder tracking, or GRT. Instead of making spatial approximations or just lazily rounding off the decimals like the FPU gambler does, GRT natively tracks the exact mathematical leftovers. Think of it as a system that never, ever throws away the spare change. It completely replaces those messy approximations with discrete deterministic shifts across a rational lattice. So it achieves this strictly unbiased bit-perfect orientation without ever asking a chip to just throw a dart at a board.
And here is the crazy part. Because this process eliminates massive, complex calculations and relies purely on exact, discrete integer rigor, it unlocks something completely staggering. It hits a hard, absolute energy floor of exactly 0.05 picojoules per operation. Honestly, that is an almost unimaginably tiny whisper of electricity.
Just to put that number into perspective for a second, that is a staggering 74 times reduction in energy compared to standard 16-bit float operations that are all clogged up with complex approximations. 74 times. We are talking about an absolute hyperdeflation of global compute costs, all because we successfully tempered the fuzzy probability of AI into rigid, exact mathematical perfection.
All right, Section 3, Calcification of Caste, Rigidity in Society. Now, what's really interesting here is we are going to completely pivot the metaphor.
We just saw that absolute rigidity and determinism is the holy grail for silicon hardware. But when that exact same rigidity is applied to human society, it is utterly toxic. Let's look at the sociological distinctions from our research. A class system is primarily economic, right? It's based on achieved status, which means vertical mobility is structurally possible. You can actually move up or down based on the market or your own achievements. A caste system, on the other hand, is entirely different. It is hereditary. It's a system of ascribed status, based purely on birth. It is a completely closed system where vertical mobility is structurally impossible. And here's the kicker. A fluid class system calcifies into a rigid caste system when the elite at the top decide to permanently close their ranks to protect their accumulated privilege.
To really wrap our heads around how this closure happens in our modern world, listen to this quote from sociologist Satish Deshpande. He notes, upper caste identity is such that it can be completely overwritten by modern professional identities of choice, whereas lower caste identity is so indelibly engraved that it overwrites all other identities. So in essence, the elite successfully encash their traditional hereditary caste capital, things like networks and land, and they launder it into modern capital, like prestigious tech degrees or fancy professional titles. They hide their monopolies behind these unmarked universal identities and just claim it's all purely casteless merit. Because the elite can hide behind professional titles, it creates a really profound sociological paradox called asymmetric stratification. The elite upper class successfully calcifies into this closed, hereditary fortress. They get to operate anonymously as the universal norm. But meanwhile, all the institutional mechanisms, the centralized bureaucracies, the automated systems, they force the lower tiers to remain hyper-visible. They are constantly tracked and permanently tagged by their birth status just to receive basic resources. It turns into this suffocating automated miasma of tracking for everyone at the bottom, while the top just cruises along as an unmarked dynasty.
So, Section 4, Shedding the Skin, Breaking the Caste. The big question is, how do we break this? How can we take the rigid, crystal-like exactness of our silicon chips that we were talking about earlier and actually use it to forcefully break down these calcified, rigid caste structures of human society? Well, the answer lies in an architectural mandate known as leaf node logistics. This is the deliberate practice of aggressively pushing concrete execution and state management way out to the extreme edges of the network. Instead of piping all your data and your identity up to some massive centralized cloud empire, which are the exact same empires that enforce that asymmetric stratification, by the way, you bypass those gatekeepers entirely. You maintain perfect, sovereign control locally.
Let's see how this builds into an actual physical descent to the bare metal. Step 1, you anchor your digital intent at the root using a highly structured, bit-perfect LIFO JSON state. That's a last-in, first-out ledger that guarantees absolute truth right at index 0. Step 2, you cross the semiotic bridge. We take that fuzzy human intent and use deterministic AI scripters running on that exact ALU surveyor we talked about to flawlessly translate it into rigid code. And step 3, physical execution. That verified code travels to a local leaf node. Picture a small robotic desktop Flow X42 cheerbot, and it fires raw electrical signals right into its general-purpose input-output, or GPIO pins. We have literally bridged an undeniable, secure digital ledger straight down to raw electrical signals that spin a motor on your desk, and we did it with zero centralized intermediaries.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the fluid forest topology, decentralized execution.
Let's connect that physical reality of the cheerbot back to our grand sociological vision. How does this kind of decentralized execution actually restructure human organization? Well, we are essentially replacing the old model with something entirely new. The old model is the centralized empire. In that system, you are just a caged user trapped in a top-heavy cloud enclosure, and your data, your value, and your identity are being constantly extracted by an unmarked elite. But the new model? That's the fluid forest topology. In this model, you are the sovereign squirrel navigating a decentralized eddy. Think about fluid dynamics for a second. An eddy is a swirl where water slows down and nutrients deposit so that life can flourish locally. In this digital forest, you store your own state locally, and digital value is finally allowed to build up right at your own leaf node.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. Deploying these deeply deterministic, rigid hardware protocols directly strips the centralized elite of their structural power. It overrides the automated miasma of legacy web systems that constantly track and tag vulnerable users. It completely bypasses the traditional institutional gatekeepers. It anchors true human effort, the literal sweat of your brow, into undeniable cryptography using that exact ALU surveyor. Ultimately, it allows us to shed the calcified skin of caste, completely replacing unearned hereditary privilege with mathematically verifiable trust.
We've seen how tempering fuzzy probability into rigid hardware exactness is the key to unlocking digital truth. But we've also seen how that exact same rigidity in society creates a toxic, calcified caste system. By finally mastering the exactness of the hardware, we now have the tools to break down those closed social fortresses. So, I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on today. Will we remain caged in a calcified empire, just letting invisible hardware guesses dictate our reality? Or will you take ownership of the exact ALU surveyor to shed the skin and orchestrate a beautifully fluid and powered forest? The choice is entirely yours. Keep learning, keep orchestrating, and I'll catch you next time on The Explainer.